Hello, welcome to Pressure Point. I'm your host, Valerie Dudoward. Our title of this program is Learning How We Went Astray. I'd like to welcome my two guests, Shirley Harding. Welcome to the program, Shirley.
Thank you.
Shirley is currently the coordinator of the Diocese of New Westminster, and you were also the former special assistant to the Primate of Canada of the Anglican Church of Canada.
On residential school.
On residential school issues specifically. And also Bob Smith, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Valerie.
I have really been looking forward to meeting you. You're currently a minister at the First United Church in the downtown east side and a former moderator of the United Church. The title, very intriguing title. We always have the best titles, mainly because my guests select them, as you did. What specifically does this refer to?
Well, it's a quotation from a prayer that was offered at an ecumenical gathering in Spain 4 years ago. And in the daily liturgy, the words were repeated, "Tell us, Lord, what has happened to us? Where did we go astray?" And what Shirley and I are dealing with as we confront the reality of the residential school experience is that we have gone astray, and we are discovering how badly we went astray and what the impact of that has been, not just on Aboriginal people, but on the whole of the church.
My mother went to one of the coastal residential schools, St. Michael's in Alert Bay, and my father grew up in a community where he was able to go to a boys' day school. And very directly in my family, I didn't hear any stories, and to my knowledge, my immediate family didn't have the kinds of horrific experiences that some other Aboriginal people have had. But certainly my more extended family and other relatives, I work in the Aboriginal community in adjacent to the downtown east side. And certainly most people who I work with are living the effects of what was a policy of the federal government that had the involvement of several of the churches. I'm trying to think of a succinct way to explain if there might be a viewer or two who isn't exactly familiar with what we mean by residential schools. Because for somebody perhaps who didn't grow up in Canada, or even who did, they may not know what that refers to.
Do you want to try that one?
Well, starting in the 1800s, the churches had mission schools in which they were educating, Christianizing the Aboriginal people of Canada. Then there was a government policy that required all children to go to residential schools. In other words, they took you as far away from home as they could. The people from the Nass Valley were brought down to St. Michael's, people from, so that you couldn't leave. In fact, you couldn't go away. Parents were threatened if they didn't send their children. And so it's a legacy that we have as a people, Canadian people. It's a legacy we have as the church. And I mean, one of the reasons for it was because they couldn't assimilate the adults. They were too smart. And so the thought was, well, we'll get the children, you see, and then there will be no more Aboriginal people. They won't remember, because we'll take away their language, their culture. We won't let them go home. And so we'll make them like us.
For example, the St. Albert Residential School near Edmonton drew people all along the main line of the CNR from Haida Gwaii through to the Swampy Cree communities of northern Manitoba.
That's a
and brought them together at a very early age and deliberately mixed them linguistically, so that the only way that they could communicate with one another was if they learned English. They were punished,
created their own language.
They were punished if they tried to speak their own language. Now, you mentioned that your mother had not had any of the horrific experiences of residential schools, and I, of course, we have, of course, been dealing with the horror stories that are in almost every time you pick up a newspaper. I've been trying to come to terms with a different kind of horror, and that's the horror of 6-year-olds to 10-year-olds crying themselves to sleep night after night after night because they've been separated from their families. And they may not have been physically or sexually abused, but they are uprooted from their primary community, and they have remained uprooted for 3 generations. That's what residential schools have left as their legacy, it seems to me.
I guess as a parent, you feel that especially strongly. And
Well, it was one of the things that, particularly during 1992 to 1995, when I was steeped in residential schools from all across the country. And at a particular convocation, Native convocation in 1993, where we spent 2 days and 2 nights listening to the stories, most of the people who were there had never told a soul. And one of the things that was said was, I remember crying myself to sleep. I was so lonely. I mean, and some of the things like having your hair cut off, like going in with
I don't think that's
long-
such a bad thing. What do you?
going in with beautiful long black hair and suddenly having your hair cut off. I remember the tears of the woman who told that
that's
story.
a huge
So
shame.
huge.
action.
So it isn't all physical and sexual abuse, but it is cultural. And I think we have to look at it as a system, and we have to look at it as something that we participated in.
Children were forced to be known by numbers. I talked to a woman in Saskatchewan who was known as C18 during her years. And not only was she so designated, but that was stenciled onto her clothing.
Almost as a prisoner would
That's the point.
be numbered
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
lettered. 11 years ago, Bob, you had spoken the words of a very important apology. What was that about, and how does that relate to what you're doing now?
Well, it relates quite directly. At the time, I was moderator of the United Church, and the Aboriginal people within the United Church told us that we needed to apologize for what had happened. And so we, as a general council, prepared that apology, and I delivered it on behalf of the council.
And where was that?
That was in Sudbury at Laurentian University. And there's a sense in which, in the intervening 11 years, I've been trying to make an honest man of myself by finding ways to put meaning into those words. And indeed, the whole of the church has tried to do that. We have, for example, here in British Columbia, we raised $1 million for what we call the Native Land Claims Fund, all of which was turned over to Native groups within British Columbia to support them in their search for a settlement of their legitimate land claims. And we established, in effect, self-government for Aboriginal peoples in the United Church. They have not exactly autonomy, but complete freedom to shape their lives with the support of the wider church. And right now, I'm the spokesperson for what is called the Healing Fund. We're attempting to replicate the BC experience and to raise $1 million, which will be made available for healing at the direction of First Nations people in Canada, in whatever way will promote healing.
And must these people be involved in one church or another?
No.
But be Aboriginal and wanting to do something.
And wanting to recover identity, culture, language, and to find healing for the ways in which, having gone astray, we hurt them.
When you started as a minister a few years ago, was there a consciousness within you or a consciousness within the church that this is a significant, I think as you both said, legacy of the church and a huge part of the history that is peculiar to the churches within the experience of Canada, I guess?
As a young person in my teens, living in Edmonton, the children from the St. Albert School were bused to my father's church. As a young minister, again in Edmonton, I was the chaplain at the St. Albert Residential School. I didn't, there were, even at that time, people who were actively involved, who were questioning the premises and saying that we needed to get out of the residential school business. But we had no idea. I certainly, as a young minister, didn't have a clue of what this was all about. And I say that with embarrassment, if not shame. But we just didn't question those kinds of things. Some people did, but I was not bright enough to question it.
Mm. What about your experience, Shirley? You have you've been involved and so proactive in some really, really interesting happenings, occurrences between and among Aboriginal people and individuals, whether it's in the performing arts, all different kinds of areas, and the church or churches in the issue of healing. What was your motivation, or has it always been there for you?
Oh, I think I, like Bob, didn't have a clue. Even in 1969, when the Hendry Report was delivered to
Which was
a report the Anglican Church commissioned to look into the treatment of and what was going on with Aboriginal people in Canada. And even then, it was recommended the Anglican Church make some drastic changes. That was when the last school was closed. It was when we then hired our first Aboriginal staff person nationally.
And the year was again?
1969. But it took until 1991 for the Anglican Church to really look at residential schools, and that was brought to us by the Aboriginal Council, it was a meeting in Winnipeg, and subsequently a working group of 4 Native and 4 non-Native participants from across Canada worked for 3 years together with 2 of us that were staff people on this issue, and I guess it's changed me incredibly, because I remember saying at the Royal Commission, and Bob and I were both at the Royal Commission's hearing for the historic mission churches, and I remember saying at that hearing that I don't know how we ever could have done this. And so it stays, that profound, intense feeling stays with me. And even though I might know a lot of the reasons now, it doesn't make it any different or any better. I think we have only begun to skim the surface of this. I think that we're looking at generations and generations of people who have been affected by residential schools. And I think for those of us in the city, we have a lot to learn about what it means for off-reserve and non-status, and what it means in the streets of Vancouver, and Métis, and what does it mean in the streets of Vancouver. And so healing has been part of my own journey and my own life too. But I think Bob and I have talked many times about how the church needs to heal. And I think this, for me, has brought that into focus. I mean, we didn't know. I mean, we still don't really. But we're beginning to understand that we need to heal.
It's, I guess, a powerful thing to hear that there's a will or a desire by even one person, and especially somebody as involved as you are and as you both are in change, be it personal or political, to think of an institution healing is pretty monumental. In what ways do you think that could happen? In what ways do you want that to happen?
Well, one of the things that, well, we're involved in a number of lawsuits, for example, and one of the lawyers for a person who is suing the United Church for what happened in the residential schools has said that the most important thing that we can do is not make money available, but say we're sorry. He says, if we don't say we're sorry, we're going to have to pay through the nose anyway, And all that's going to happen is that there are going to be a whole bunch of dysfunctional, wealthy Native people. And that apology, saying that we're sorry and meaning that we're sorry, is the key ingredient in any healing, both for the aggrieved person and for the aggressor. So we think that if we can begin to realize the cultural baggage that we brought to the task of sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, as we would say, that the kind of new humility that would be the result would contribute greatly to the establishment of healthy communities. But as long as we approach the sharing of what we believe with a sense of superiority, or all the nice things we're going to do for you poor people,
That's what got the church in trouble in the first place.
That's exactly
perhaps.
it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah. So that's what we're trying to say we're sorry for.
Yeah. I want to pick up on that too. And in 1993, when the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada made an apology, which was very moving, he then asked all the other bishops to make specific apologies for the schools that were in their own areas.
Yes.
The question for us now, and Bob has said this, is how do we live out that apology? A lot of Aboriginal people say words are cheap. We've heard this before, so what are you going to do? And I don't think it is necessarily just a matter of handing over money. I think one of the major roles is for the church to listen and to really mean it, to really be present and to listen and cry and say, yeah, you know, we did that. And bring some humanness, I think, to that.
Why do you think it is, and I know that you can't, probably would not want to speak for any other institution, but why is it that there are two major religious institutions that have very strongly come forward in this country called Canada to become, I believe in many senses, proactive in the area of looking at healing from the residential school experience, but not all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true. I think that there are 4 so-called historic mission churches. That's the label that has been given in, for example, in the Royal Commission
On Aboriginal
peoples. They referred to the 4 historic mission churches: the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Anglican Church, and the United Church. In each instance, official representatives of those churches have said words that sound like apology. In some instances, what appears to be a kind of intransigence on the part of church leaders puts the lie to those words of apology. But that's true at every level of each of our 4 churches. So we represent, I think, a real sense, the Anglican Church and the United Church.
Mm-hmm.
And we would say, we are able to say, in the case of the United Church, that we are profoundly and publicly remorseful for our part in the residential school project. But there are other things which people in the United Church say and do which put the lie to that. And the same would be true of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I sense what you're saying.
But you don't agree with it, Valerie.
Well, of course not. No. I guess what I really want to spend a few minutes concentrating on, because I really believe in building on good work that's started in the community, and certainly I know of your work in the downtown east side specifically, and such an unusual move for somebody who was in your, I guess, sort of former geographic position to embrace the idea of moving to the downtown east side. And And I'm really familiar with Shirley's work in the whole area of healing in residential schools and some of the innovative kinds of projects that you've tackled. If viewers are watching this and are wondering, how might I get involved? Or maybe I don't want to commit to getting involved, but how might I find out more about this healing fund or what my church is doing? Is there a central type of information thing, or whom should people contact?
I'll jump in and just say that the Anglican Church has gone the route with the Aboriginal Council is in a process of self-determination. They are building a parallel church to the Anglican Church. They have healing money too. Nationally, we gave $250,000 between 1992 and 1995. There's 100,000 available a year for grassroots healing, and so anybody can apply for that.
Is that in which area would that be? Which geographic area?
All across Canada, anywhere.
So you could be anywhere.
Yep. Yeah. There are excellent videos, and I, proudly say that the Anglican Church has done some amazing videos on this whole issue. There is a book called Shingwak's Vision, written by a professor of history named Jim Miller, which I think is excellent. Now, it's very daunting. It's 600 pages, but if you really want to learn about it, it's a really phenomenal read.
It just happened to have.
If you could hold that up just for
This is the Nuchalna study, which was published in February of this year, and this is an anecdotal study of people, Nuchalnath people in the main, who participated in, I think, 7 or 8 residential schools in British Columbia, and these are verbatims of conversations with people. One of the fascinating things that I know you want to talk about is the number of people, including Aboriginal leaders, we were talking about this earlier,
yes,
who say that people who are using the residential school experience as that many people are using it as a kind of crutch.
Exactly. It's
you did want to talk about it, didn't you?
Well, just a tiny bit. It's a message that I hear repeated definitely outside the Aboriginal community. I would expect that.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes people feel very inundated with whatever the significant issue of the day is, whatever it might be. In this instance, we're talking about decades and decades and decades of behaviors and generations of people that resulted from policy enacted by a government, and probably the best wishes of people who had a philosophy they wanted to share. I guess if I could put it that way. But what surprises me to some degree and horrifies me a lot is when I hear that message of, I'm tired of hearing about this from within the Aboriginal community, where sometimes perhaps it's community leaders or leaders, at even a broader geographic or power structure level say, well, gee whiz, I went to residential school, or as I said earlier, my mother went to residential school. Not everybody had the gut-wrenching kind of experience that I've heard and that we've all heard so often. And I do wonder sometimes if people, when they hear those two words, if they're on some type of burnout where they turn off or think it's 40 years later, it's 50 years later, it's 20 years later.
But it's the same thing that people are saying about poor people in general. They're saying, well, I made it. I was able to make the system work. I hauled myself up by my bootstraps. I didn't have an easy time. Why can't they do the same thing? And what they are not dealing with is the fact that we do not choose, it seems to me. We do not get to choose we don't choose our genes. We don't choose the time and place in which we live. We don't choose our gender. Well, that's another program, though, isn't it? And I can't take any credit for the decisions that I've made in my life. the brokenness that I see among the Aboriginal people with whom I work in the downtown east side is not something over which they have choice. Who would choose to live in a rodent-infested SRO in Gastown?
Yeah.
Who would choose the kind of suffering that the people that we know endure every day? And
But you know, another thing I want to pick up on what you said is, and I, you know, this is probably not something to say on the air, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Good.
Some of those Aboriginal leaders who are saying, "Oh, well, why don't they get on with it?" They're denying their community healing because they're not helping the communities to engage in healing, which has to happen if the community is to move forward. I mean, I've seen it too many times. So
It's
It's
certainly
complex.
It's complex, and
it's
I
complex.
think we've managed to scratch the surface of a really important issue. And Shirley Harding, Bob Smith, I thank you for joining me on this program, Pressure Point. This has been Pressure Point. My name is Valerie Dudoward. Thank you for joining us.
Mm.